Stanford University.
She'll be making its rounds. Next week we have Jeremy Bailenson, who is a professor, associate professor in the Department of Communication here at Stanford. Today I'd like to welcome Pamela Hinds. Pam is an associate professor in the Department of Managerial Science and Engineering. And welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for everybody for coming on Good Friday, and I learned that it's also the WISC deadline, so it's a very big day. Today what I'm going to talk about is some research that I've been doing with Catherine Crampton, who's at George Mason University, looking at site visits in global work, when people are globally distributed, trying to coordinate their work together, but have these visits to one another's sites. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with HCI or technologies? There's no technology there, right? Except maybe the airplanes that take them there. The reason I think that this work is important for HCI and CSCW is because what we're trying to do is unpack, well, why do these site visits matter? Why do people think that they're a really big deal, and why do they think that they really transform their ability to work together? If we can understand that, perhaps we can begin to understand what kinds of affordances we need to be building into communication technologies or collaboration technologies in order to reduce the carbon footprint and decrease the amount that people feel they need to travel in order to coordinate the work. Now, at the outset, I'll say I don't think, based on what we learned, that all the travel is going to go away and we're going to be able, at least today, to do this via technology. But I do actually think that there are some things that we can do to provide for some of the things that happened during these site visits. So that's what I'm going to spend the next hour doing. I'm going to try to finish so that we've got at least 15-20 minutes for discussion. This paper is under second review in a management journal in organization science. I would love to get feedback, and I also think it'd be great to have a discussion, more of a discussion about, well, what does this mean for technology? What might we build or be building that could help? Okay, so I've sort of given an overview, but one of the things that is remarkably absent from most of the literature that looks at globally distributed teams, or even distributed teams for that matter, is any discussion of what happens when they get together. There's kind of an assumption that you're either distributed or you're co-located. And there's some discussion about face-to-face interactions, but the truth is an awful lot of teams, particularly those that are really interdependent, working together over a long period of time on projects, they do get together and see one another from time to time, whether it's every 4 months or 6 months or whatever. That's actually a part of the whole process of working on a globally distributed team. Yet, it's something that we tend not to talk about, and we tend not to sort of explore, well, what's going on during these meetings. And what we found is that these site visits actually play a key role, and what I'll try to do today is unpack that. I'm going to break it down into what actually happened during these visits. What were the practices that people engaged in, particularly when they had positive outcomes? They didn't always. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're calling situated knowing who. There's a lot out there on situated knowing or situated know-how. We're saying there's also this piece of situated knowing that's about knowing about the people that you're working with. That's really important here. And it leads to relational coordination, which I'll describe in more detail through the talk. So situated knowing, probably many in this room are familiar with the research on situated knowing. The basic idea is that knowledge and learning are situated in the activity, situated in the action. One of the more famous examples is midwifery. The only way that you can learn to be a midwife is by actually being there when children are being born and understanding and learning about the process by seeing what goes on, in part because there's just a lot that can't be explained, and also a lot that changes over time. So Orlikowski talks about knowing how, and she explicitly uses knowing how rather than know-how to convey that this is not something that you figure out and you're done with, but it's something that you are developing constantly as you're working together. It's knowing how as opposed to getting it right and stopping. And what, as I mentioned earlier, we found was that the situated knowing who among global workers seemed to happen to a large extent during these site visits. So, go into a little bit more detail. My example is going to be scuba diving. So scuba diving, how many scuba divers do we have here? Oh, just a handful. Okay. So scuba diving is actually a pretty technical sport. You have to know a lot about the equipment and the dive tables and currents and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of what we would call know-how when it comes to scuba diving. But there's also a lot of situated knowing in that every dive is really a completely new experience. You don't have any idea, well, you have some idea, but it really changes in terms of the temperature, the currents, the wildlife that happens to be there, where you are on the reef, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of knowing in action as well. What we're adding to this is the piece that's more social, really, and saying, okay, well, in diving, at least most regulations are that you would never dive alone. You usually dive with a buddy. You often dive with a dive master who's familiar with the location. And with that buddy, there's actually a lot that you need to know in order to accomplish the goals of that dive and remain safe. So how risk-seeking is that other diver? How good are they at controlling their buoyancy? What other dives have they gone on, and what does that mean for the depth that they can go to today? How are they around wildlife? What are they afraid of, and so on and so forth. So that is what we're calling the knowing who. That's the understanding of the person that you are interacting with in this dive situation, and that is also very contingent upon the dive that you're on at that point in time, because it's going to depend a lot on the weather, the currents, whether you're in salt and fresh water, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of the general idea of what we're going for here. And this, by the way, is my husband and I diving in Palau. So taking this sort of situated perspective on global work is not new. Others have argued that we need to understand the situated nature of the work in the past. There's evidence that contextual differences in the practices and perspectives of workers can have a profound effect on their ability to collaborate successfully together. Deborah Soll and Amy Edmondson did some work looking at knowledge sharing, and what they found was that even when people knew that somebody at another site had more expertise, they would still often talk to the local experts because they just trusted that they knew the context better. So that kind of contextual understanding of what's going on is really important. And then Vonda Orlikowski did a really nice piece where she looked at the practices of people in these distributed work arrangements and identified how they evolved their practices together as they were working together. But again, everything that's out there, as far as we know, is really looking at the knowing how and not the knowing who piece of that. There's also, of course, been quite a bit of research on face-to-face meetings. We are not in this work talking about meetings. We're talking about site visits, meaning that people are actually going to the location at which their collaborators are working, and they're spending usually some kind of extended period of time there. So if they just go attend a meeting and then leave, we don't consider that a site visit. They need to actually be there working side by side for some period of time. Usually the minimum seemed to be about a week, although sometimes it was 3 days, and sometimes it was up to several months. But we do know a lot about face-to-face meetings, and there's evidence that the face-to-face meetings allow people to build more affective relationships, to develop trust in one another. Kathy Chadoba's work suggests that meeting face-to-face and at regular intervals actually helps create a rhythm in the team that helps the teams perform well. In Solon Edmondson's work, they did find that these face-to-face meetings really were the time when people were able to transfer knowledge to one another as they developed more rapport with one another. Okay, so I'm also going to introduce this concept of relational coordination. So this is a reasonably new term in the management literature. Jody Gattel is the one that introduced it, and the basic idea is that we've got a definition here, a mutually reinforcing process of interaction between communication and relationships carried out for the purpose of task integration. What that basically means is that in order to coordinate effectively, you need to have some kind of effective relationship with the people that you're working with. That facilitates communication, responsiveness, what they call problem solving or problem-oriented communication, and respect among people. Okay, so what we saw, as I mentioned, was that during site visits, this knowing who was developed among the globally distributed workers. It was enacted during the site visits, reconstituted, and most importantly, it actually transformed the working relationship between people even after the site visit was over, even after people went home. And the positive effects lasted for quite some time, a year, more than a year, depending upon the volatility of the group. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the study that we conducted. This is a study of globally distributed software development teams. All of the teams were split between 2 locations. 3 of them were split between the US and Western Europe. 3 were split between Western Europe and India. 3 from that same company were split between India and the United States. And then we had 3 additional teams from another company that were also software development teams, and they were split between India and the United States. And this was an ethnographic research study where we conducted interviews with pretty much all of the team members on location, and we did observations of a subset of the teams that we were looking at. So we studied 2 of these teams, or observed 2 of these teams, 2 of these teams, and 2 of those teams. And we did what we call concurrent observations, where we had a member of the research team in each location during that same week, so that we could understand sort of understand the different perspectives during that same point in the project. What we didn't want to do is observe different weeks and then find out that there's a big deadline or there was something else that was happening in the environment that really affected the different patterns that we were seeing. Okay, and then we also, we went back in phase 2, conducted additional interviews with the managers, and we sat with the teams and presented what our preliminary insights from the work that we'd done, and talked with them a little bit about what we were seeing and got additional reflections and input from them. Well, I guess I'll say, we did sort of traditional ethnographic grounded theory analysis. We looked for themes in the data, and one of the things I'll say is that we didn't design this study to look for site visits. This is something that emerged during the open coding. It was a theme that we saw in the interviews. People repeatedly talked about how important the site visits were. So at that point, we decided that this was something that we really needed to look more deeply into and in our data. So this is a quote that I just love. I think it really exemplifies what we've got here. So this informant says, talking about a site visit, you develop a comfort level. I don't know how to explain it. And he's just, it's just out of grasp. He says, there's just something that's different. I'm just more comfortable, but I can't really put my fingers on what it is that was going on. So what we attempted to do in our analysis is try to unpack it and figure out, well, what was it that was going on? Why did, over 60% of the people that we talked to refer to being more comfortable after a site visit? What did that really mean, and why was it that that was happening? And this is the model that we've come up with, and it is along the lines of what I showed earlier. Basically, you've got some practices that people engage in during these site visits, and we kind of break those down. There's this knowing who in practice that kind of develops, and I'll describe what the components of that were. And then it ended up with relational coordination, based on that definition I gave you earlier by Gattel. And we specifically looked at these dimensions of relational coordination and saw that, in fact, when people talked about what was different after the site visits, that's really, those are the categories that those fell into. So I'll go through each of these. So the practices, one of the things that people talked a lot about is discussing work together. So during the site visits, they actually sat down and they talked about work together. And you might say, well, don't they do that all the time during their video conferences and their teleconferences and so forth? Yeah, but it looked different. It was much more informal, and there were snippets of time. So they might have a meeting, more of a formal meeting for an hour, but then what they would do is check in a couple hours later, talk for another 5 or 10 minutes, go back to their work for another block of time, come back, chat again, maybe chat in the coffee corner, and so on and so forth. So it was a much more continuous kind of process that where they would work and then they would discuss their work together. As this person says, I can't remember a span of more than an hour where I wasn't talking with one of them, sitting right there. They had questions, what do you think about this, and so forth. So this is kind of informal chatting back and forth. The other thing that we saw in terms of practices during the visits were disclosing of personal information and socializing together. So there was a lot of going to lunch together, going for coffee, walking around the castles when they visited Europe, having a barbecue here in the US, and so on and so forth. So that was really prevalent during the site visits. In this example, they're talking about, that we know she has a family and she has kids, so it's not as easy for her to travel and come here. She can arrange it, but I know that about her background. And this kind of thing was really important because what she was telling us in this case was, before the visit, I actually didn't know that about her personal context. And she had actually told us before that she'd been frustrated because this person hadn't come to visit for the several years that they'd been working together, and they didn't understand, was it a lack of commitment to the project, what is it that was going on? And then she said, well, now I know why. It all makes sense why she couldn't come and visit, because she's got young children. Observing work. The other thing that we heard a lot about is just being able to see how it is people work. What resources do they use? What stretches of time do they work in? Do they work for a half hour and then take a break, or do they work for a long period of time and then go take a longer break? I mean, what are the rhythms and patterns of the work that people are engaged in? What knowledge do they invoke when they're working? This is just a great quote for that. I could see them. I could see the way they work. I mean, you're sitting next to them, you observe them, they work, and then you get to know a lot about them. So just seeing people as they work was really key. And then observing social behavior. This was another one of my favorites. It seemed to be extremely important to be able to see people's behavior in their quote-unquote native context. So this is an example where there was a developer in India who had said he'd been working with this guy Hans for a long period of time, about 6 months, and he said, he just was rude and abrasive. It was clear. I don't know why, I don't know what I did, but Hans didn't like me. And he said, I tried so hard, I did everything, but nothing I did seemed to matter, so I just kind of gave up. He said, until I went to, in this case, Germany, and he said, Hans was so much more rude and abrasive with his German colleagues than he'd ever been with me, that I realized that's just how he is. That's just the kind of guy that he is. And in fact, he was trying. He was actually trying to be nice to me, but it didn't come across because that's just not the kind of guy he was. So seeing people in their native social environments provided a ton of information about how they treated other people, how they were treated, were they respected, what was their social network like, did people go to them for advice, and so on and so forth. A ton of information was gathered just informally that way. Okay, so those are the practices that we saw by the teams that really got benefit out of the site visits. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about why they mattered, what they learned. So one of the things they learned was a lot about people's work and communication styles. They got a sense of, as I said before, how long they work for. Did they take breaks? Did they mind being interrupted? How did they communicate? Like this person says, afterward there's less anxiety about the misunderstanding, because they know that you had never had any ill intent or any reason for asking that thing that they might perceive as or misinterpret as anything but what you thought it was. You'll need to resolve any need to really read between the lines. So now things just were much more clear because they had a sense of who it was coming from. Also knowing coworkers' expertise. In one case, there was a team that was working between India and the United States. And the team, things were not going well on the team. It was a very high-profile project. And the team members in India were perceived as just not delivering. And the project manager said, we just didn't think they had the capability. They didn't have the expertise to do the job, and we were just on the brink of dissolving the collaboration with India because we decided that this was too high of a profile, of a project to let it fail. But he said our last-ditch effort was we brought the Indian colleagues over here, and he said, we figured out that they were extremely talented. They had all the expertise that we needed. And in fact, on this 25-person team, several of them were probably the strongest. They were stronger than the American developers. But we didn't know that because we hadn't seen them work. We didn't know what kinds of obstacles they were running into. We didn't know the kinds of problems that they were having. And most importantly, we didn't know that we weren't giving them the information they needed to be successful. Once they figured that out, they were then able to work much more successfully together. Also knowing the informal roles, as I was saying earlier, figuring out, who's respected by whom, what kinds of roles do they play in the group. A lot of that is not something that's talked about, and you need to just be there to see it. So like this guy says, I noticed that some guys are really well appreciated by others. You have to see, it's only possible if you see how people interact with each other to get that. And then understanding coworkers' personalities, and this is similar to what I talked about with Hans, really figuring out, what are these people really like? How do I interpret their humor? How do I interpret their behaviors and so forth? And this is not Hans, this is another guy. And this is also an Indian colleague. He says, though he sounds angry, he's not really angry. He's just giving you information. And he may sound rude, but that's not what he means. And you don't have to do much about it. And I think that's a really crucial part of this quote, because he's saying, well, now I don't have to worry about that anymore. That's just the way that he is. I don't have to be cautious in my interaction with him, because that's just his personality, and I know that now. And then the other piece is knowing the cultural context. By going to the other location, people learned a lot about the way that things are done in that cultural context. And got insight into why it is the people they're working with might want to do things in a particular way. It's an example from Germany. I could identify their work and their culture because if you see how the Germans work in their life, for them, quality, is utmost. And when you're in the country and you see everybody else working that way, then you understand why they emphasize that so much in their work. So again, sort of seeing that entire cultural context help them make sense of people's behavior in a different way than they had before. Okay, so as I said, what I'm actually really interested in is the fact that this persisted. These differences persisted even after people went home. And the kinds of things that they affected were communication, responsiveness, how they communicated with one another, the kinds of things they talked about, mutual respect, and also increased disclosure. And the reason this one's in red is because this was not on the original set of dimensions for relational coordination, but it's a theme that we saw time and time again in our data, that after they went home from the site visits, they changed the way that they were sharing information, personal kinds of information. So we added it to the list. So with regard to relational coordination, people just talked more. And what was interesting is they talked longer when they did talk, and they also talked more frequently. And people said, they were just more comfortable, for example, picking up the phone and calling somebody, and they weren't anxious anymore about there being a misunderstanding or them offending somebody inadvertently. So, they just talked more often and talked at greater length about things. The other thing that happened is that there were significant changes in how responsive they were, and we heard this from both groups. So we heard people say, I'm now much more responsive to the people that I work with at this other site, and people are much more responsive to me. So rather than having to wait, say, a week for a response while somebody sort of tries to figure out how to respond to a question, people would reply now within, say, 24 hours. And they were much more comfortable with very quick kinds of responses, again, because they weren't so anxious about saying something wrong, creating a problem, offending somebody, and so forth. As this guy says, find out he's a nice guy, and the next time you send emails or you call them, you get the answer right away. The other thing we saw is that the way that they talk about things following the site visits is also really quite different. They're much more willing to point out problems. They're much more willing to raise issues. They're both on their own side, they're willing to admit that they have a problem in the task that they're performing, and they're also willing to tell the people they're working with that they perceive a problem on their side. So they're willing to grapple more with the content of the work than they were before. Prior to the site visits, they were much more cautious about admitting to not knowing something or admitting to there being a problem in the work. So as this guy says, if you have any problems, you just call them up and ask them, what's the problem? And then they're able to talk at that level. Mutual respect, we actually didn't see this a ton in our data. Most of it, as I'll show you on a slide a little bit later, came with the collaborators from India felt like they gained more respect when they went on site visits, and people who interacted with the Indian colleagues also said that they now respected those collaborators more than they had prior to the site visits. As this person says, somebody from the US talking about the India site, by being here and working with the team, I think they got more respect on how they work. I don't think that was the case before. Some of the engineers here, now realize that they're actually pretty good. And then, as I mentioned, we added this other dimension about increased disclosure. Prior to the site visits, communication was very formal. If they sent an email, it was really quite formal to the point. Oftentimes, at least from the India site, it was read by multiple people before it was sent to make sure that it was okay. After the site visits, communication became much more informal. When they would start their meetings, their video conferences or teleconferences, they would actually talk about personal things now. They'd say, oh yeah, your daughter was getting married. How was that? You were going on vacation, your son, and so forth. And this was in part because they now knew about their personal lives more, so they knew what to ask about. They also knew what was important. They knew that, marriages and weddings in India were hugely important, and you really wanted to be asking about that. And they learned that it wasn't taboo to ask about some of these things. Before they were nervous about, is it okay to ask about a marriage? Is it okay to ask about a vacation, or is that private? With the cultural differences, they just didn't know what it was even okay to say to others or ask about. So, as this person says, it used to be just directly to the agenda. Now when they start the meetings, they ask, how was your weekend? You're going on vacation? Those kinds of informal conversations. Okay, so that sort of builds the whole model here. And what we're arguing is that these practices enable the knowing who, and the knowing who enables the relational coordination following the site visit that also then feeds back into more knowing who, because they're also sharing more of this personal information and continuing to engage in some of these practices. Now, of course, over time that diminishes because they're not seeing what's going on in the context, but particularly the increased disclosure helped to maintain this practice over time. Now, the original model for relational coordination argues that if you've got these high-performance work practices on your teams, then you will have relational coordination. And what we think actually might be going on certainly on the teams that we observed, but we think probably in the co-located teams that Jodi Cattell studied, is it's actually through the process of knowing who. But we don't know that, we don't see that in the co-located teams because there's no stark contrast between being together versus not being together. It's just something that happens all the time. Yeah.
So I think different physical organizations have really different affordances for these kinds of practices. You look at a big open studio plan building versus one that has lots of nooks and crannies and high walls. Yeah. And in addition, the customs of like, do you have lunch together and all that. And so I bet you would find, I'm sure you've thought of this, co-located organizations that look quite a lot like highly remote organizations and those that are that have much more of these opportunities for knowing this.
I hadn't thought about that, but that would be a great way to get at it, to really see whether or not that's going on. Now, most of her work, and she's really been the only one that's looked at it because it's a relatively new construct, and I think it was actually her dissertation. Most of her work has looked at the medical field. So you've got the medical teams that are really working very closely together in physical space. But I think I agree. I think it would be really interesting to look at organizations where that's not happening. My guess is you'd see lower levels of relational coordination as a result. Yeah.
Just kind of a related question.
Yeah.
Going back to some of your reports, in the quotes, the third person was used an awful lot, like they and them. So I wonder about us-they differences and what the basis for it might be. In this disparate one, how much was cultural, how much just organizational, and what a control for that might be. To the perfectly co-located one, again, you get the business even in the industry, university breakdown provides all sorts of problems for us there.
Yep, and we, in the years that I've been studying these globally distributed teams, it's almost impossible, I think, not to develop an us versus them dynamic when you are spread so far away from one another, because the signals for the us are just not salient enough. When we're all together, it's pretty clear that we're a team, right? But when a group is largely interacting with, at least in physical space and in terms of time zone, with one group, and the other group is interacting amongst themselves at the other location, even if they're working, quote unquote, closely together and they're really interdependent, there's just such opportunity for that split. And anytime something goes wrong, that us versus them tends to go up. Now, are there ways to avoid that? Yeah, I think so. I think that really emphasizing the team nature of the work together. I think there are some technologies that you can use that create more of a team portal that signals that this is the whole team. It's not just those of us at the site. I'm teaching a global work class right now to undergraduates, and every class session I say, you are one team. I want you, when you send me things for assignments, I want all of the members on the whole team copied on the emails. Happens 50% of the time. I mean, it's just remarkable. And they talk about the team in Holland. It's like, no, actually, it's a single team.
Playing off your experience, that also falls on management's plate to reduce the negative effects of that. So maybe there's an entree to the more basic problem.
Yeah, and I do think the site visits also help with that. I think that as people get to know them as people, we see less of that. And actually, there's some other things going on that I'll also talk about in a later slide that I think feed into that as well. Yeah.
So I have a question, which may come up in a later slide.
Okay.
The framework you have here and the observations are all stated in a symmetric, neutral way. My guess is that in these situations there are power and status asymmetries. The Indians, for example, are not seen as equal.
Yes.
So is there a finer grain model which brings those asymmetries of power into account?
Yes, and it'll be on a later slide.
Okay.
So
Good.
I will talk about that. Yeah.
I'm wondering how much of a role cultural context plays in the relational coordination. So you're talking about software teams in particular. So software people aren't necessarily, engineers are not necessarily traditionally relational people, right? It's more meritocratic, more work kind of focused. If you were to study, I don't know if you've studied like sales teams, for example, or teams maybe in like Latin America where the culture is much more relational, whether you see more relational coordination that happens despite whether or not there's a site visit or not.
So I haven't studied sales teams or marketing, kind of the more extroverted types of professions. Although I have studied designers, but I don't know that I've got data that would help us understand this. I've studied R&D and software development mainly. But I would say that the Indian culture is also pretty relational. And maybe not as much as South America, I'm not sure. But the attempts, the challenge was the attempts to try to build those relationships didn't always go so well. And I think that because, in the more relational cultures, the lack of relationship was felt more and it was more problematic, but I don't think it actually helped that much in creating the ties. That would be my my gut instinct without having actually looked deeply at that data. Okay, so this begins to get at Terry's question, although it's not the entire answer yet. One of the things we did was we looked at the role. Well, who's actually doing the traveling? And does it matter whether you're the one doing the traveler, you're the visitor, or you're hosting the visitor, or you're talking to the people who did the traveling, but you didn't actually go anywhere? And that did matter a lot. So the visitors are the ones that seem to get pretty much all of the benefits that we talked about. They really got insight into communication styles, work styles, expertise, cultural context, and so on and so forth. The hosts, because they didn't go to the other site, got some of the benefits, but they didn't get everything. So for example, they didn't get much of an understanding about the cultural context. They didn't get very much of an understanding about the informal structure and roles because they weren't seeing the way that people were interacting in their native context. And then I think most importantly, the non-travelers, the non-travelers, they talked about their colleagues at the distant site in a completely different way than did the visitors or the hosts. They actually used very abstract language in talking about the other site. So while a visitor or host would talk about having learned that somebody has children or learned that somebody works hard, the people who didn't travel would say, well, the Germans are this way, or I've talked to so-and-so who traveled and now I know that Americans are that way. So very sort of broad generalizations that were surprisingly abstract. And I'm not sure why that is. I don't know whether or not the travelers aren't conveying the detail or if it just can't be, it doesn't make sense to the person who's receiving it. They can't really, they don't have sort of a structure within which to make sense of what the visitor is trying to explain.
So this gets back to your broader framing about situated knowledge. And I had a question then that I held on to. I'm curious whether the way that you're thinking about situated knowledge here, I can imagine that at the high level you could tell the story in one of two ways. One is you could say, all knowledge is situated, and thinking about it in that way is, and understanding that is really important. And the other thing you could say is you could be be like, well, there's some knowledge that's more situated and like, and other knowledge that's more portable, abstract, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And if you took that view, then I imagine you'd say, well, the portable stuff is easier to communicate to somebody else, presumably. That's the kind of stuff that makes it into textbooks or whatever. And the situated stuff, for some reason, is harder to explain to others. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, it's interesting because I'm probably still, I'd say, even a little bit on the fence about that. But I think what the data suggests to me is that all of this kind of knowing who is situated because of this. I mean, if it weren't situated, then the people who didn't travel, who didn't go anywhere, who didn't host anybody, would have, in talking to people, gathered that knowledge, but they simply couldn't. They talked to people, they tried really hard. I mean, one of the roles sometimes of the visitors was to come back and convey that knowledge to the rest of the team that didn't travel, but it simply didn't happen. They attempted, but it didn't get picked up, which suggests to me that it's because it was situated.
And in that case, is what makes something situated the some intrinsic property of that kind of knowledge or something, or is it the absence of a frame for abstracting it? Like, in other words, what do you put on the fact that makes it situated and not abstract? Is it that, oh, we don't have a way of distilling that, or is it, no, there's some stuff that's intrinsically unabstractable?
That's a great question. Yeah, I would have to think more about that. My gut says that it's not about the recipient not having the frame. It's about the fact that it's situated, and because it's situated, transferring it just doesn't make sense. But Wendy has a question or a thought.
I was just preparing my arms so I didn't get lost for the next question. So if you're done with that, I have a follow-on kind of different question. So I'm actually interested. This is all pitched as if it's always going in a positive direction. So getting better, getting to know people better. Now these things are. So we actually did some studies at Xerox, and we were looking at teams from Japan, California, and England, and the Netherlands. And what we found was that, in fact, sometimes things degraded, and that sometimes, definitely a lot of the things that you're talking about were absolutely there, but there was also this weird interaction effect with the technology, and it gets to Terry's point about the power struggles. So, for example, the Americans were the ones who had the most power, and then when they ran the meeting, they thought it was a great meeting, and the Europeans thought it was not such a great meeting. And they got into what they called university challenge type things with, all of the Americans lined up on one side and all the Europeans lined up on the other, and they had their lovely video conference, but it's not a social exchange and so on. They did have back and forth meetings and so on, but somehow this was a case where the technology actually took relationships that were working with people who had to visit. Then they introduced this cool new technology, and all of a sudden those relations started breaking down. So anyway, I'm just saying that it doesn't have to go in both, it can go in both directions, and the technology can actually have an impact. You haven't really talked about the video conferencing thing, but we found a kind of negative thing, which is why we're doing media spaces and other kinds of things as well, but because there's ways of pitching the technology.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, and I don't have anything on the impact of the technology, but we do, let's see how far, right here, the team level. We did look at, so it wasn't always rosy, which is why earlier I was saying the teams that did these things had successful site visits. Not all of the teams had successful site visits. And there were a couple of things that were going on. I mean, one of the biggest things is that if a team felt threatened, usually what that meant was the work was moving either from the U.S. to India or Germany to India. The site visits didn't go well. It perpetuated the rifts that already existed in the team and made people feel even worse about one another because if they were visiting a team in the U.S. that didn't want them there, then those people were then bad hosts, and it was unpleasant. So for the teams that had high levels of relational coordination, most members of the team traveled at some point in time, not necessarily all at the same time, but at some point during these multi-year projects. They engaged in all of the practices that I outlined as being important to site visits, and they were strong in all aspects of relational coordination. So it's all good.
Can you maybe give us more detail in terms of what's considered a few site visits and what's considered good interaction versus low level of interaction? Like what the distinctions are between these three?
Yeah. I'll sort of do it by way of telling some stories about some of these. So I'll jump now to the low relational coordination teams. So these were a few site visits or a low level of interaction during them. What that often meant was that the manager or the project lead traveled, but the team members didn't travel. Usually it was one directional rather than visiting, seeing both sites, and usually that meant it was from the low power site to the high power site. And these were the teams that often were characterized by strong fear and competition. And one of the examples, it was actually really heartbreaking talking to these people because it was an Indian team that had come to the U.S., very talented young developers, and the team in the U.S. knew that their work is going to eventually get shipped to India, but the decision hadn't been made yet, and they absolutely just didn't want the Indian team members to be talented or successful because what that meant for them was too dire, right? So, somebody in management decided that the way to fix this was get them all together. Well, when they got all together, they didn't sit to...
warfare?
Yeah.
What do you expect?
Exactly. Yeah, there were a few things they probably should have done beforehand, but when they got, quote unquote, got together, the Indian team sat on a different floor than the U.S. workers. There wasn't space for them, so they actually had virtually no interaction. They didn't see one another work. During lunch, they sat at different tables, and the Indian folks said, they were mostly vegetarians. This was in Texas. And after a several-week visit, they were starving, they were beside themselves, they hadn't been sort of taken care of by their local hosts. They went to, finally, in a desperate attempt to get some food, they went to McDonald's and they ordered cheeseburgers, thinking that it would be cheese. And they said, that was just it. They were just so demoralized after that. They couldn't make their way, and they weren't hosted properly. Needless to say, things did not improve after this site visit. They continued to have very poor coordination on this team, and it didn't improve during the time that we did the study. Then there were these sort of middle kinds of teams where they had okay relational coordination, but not ideal. In some cases, it was they didn't have a whole lot of site visits, but they had a lot of interaction during them. They engaged in most of the practices, and they used them as effectively as they could. And they often were not just the manager or leader, but they were key members of the team. And in some cases, there were many visits, but there was this fear and competition. So, You know, they weren't really able, even through kind of good site visits, to overcome this fear and competition. We never, in the 12 years I've been doing this research, I've never seen a team be successful when they have that sense of threat. It just doesn't work.
Do you have a main sense of where that threat sense comes from? Is there one font of that, or are there many?
It mostly comes, in the work that we've done, it mostly comes from the U.S. being afraid that their work is going to move to India. We don't see it so much in Europe because people they don't lose their jobs. They don't lose their livelihood if their work goes to India. They just may not have the job that they had before. They may not have a job that they want, but they at least can feed their families.
Is there anything, I'm sort of thinking of perhaps a follow-up in the future as to whether or not these people still work at the company? Perhaps these fears and miscooperation are very well founded.
They were.
It is in fact tied to a very explicit outcome within this group.
Oh, they were. They were absolutely founded. I mean, they were right to believe that the work was shifting to India. In one of the cases here, the team was told, well, you know, this project is really important, it's growing, we're going to shift all the maintenance work to India so that you guys can focus on the really high-level, important, creative design stuff. And rightfully, they were a little skeptical about whether or not that was true, and the truth was actually it happened pretty quickly. I'd say in less than a year and a half, all of the work had gone to India because it became clear that, you know, who knew about, you know, the Indians knew about the software. They'd been maintaining it. It just made sense for them to begin to pick up the design work. So, yeah, I'm not saying that the fears weren't grounded. I am saying that it wasn't handled very well by management. The other thing that was missing, so that they did develop an understanding of the communication, cultural context, and so forth, but in these teams, it was the mutual respect and the willingness to actually work through problems that seemed to be missing. Okay. Oh. Shoot, I thought I had another one. I might have taken that out to your point, Terry. There were differences in by site in terms of what learning seemed to be the most important. So for the Indian site, gaining respect was really, really important because they were definitely the low status site here. And gaining respect from both the US and Germany was really important. For Europe and the US, it was relatively even in terms of the kind of knowledge that seemed to be important. So the outlier on that was in India. Okay, so just very quickly, what we're trying to do here is, just illuminate the what we think is an understudied interplay between the site visits and the distant work. I think that a large percentage of teams that are working globally for an extended period of time engage in these practices, and we really just don't know that much about what happens and why they're meaningful. Historically, there's been, most of the research is really kind of focused on a bandwidth explanation. If you can just get a bigger pipe, then you don't need to travel. You can learn everything you need to learn, you can share all the information you need to share. But I think it's more nuanced than that, and we're trying to sort of push beyond that just a bandwidth view of things. Extending this idea of just situated knowing to also this knowing who piece, which I think it's a part of situated knowing, but it's a piece that just hasn't really been looked at certainly in the management literature. And then suggest that knowing who may be a moderator between these high-performance work practices and relational coordination, regardless of whether or not people are distant. And I think it does, in my mind, points to, well, where do we want to think about new kinds of collaboration technologies? in terms of supporting these teams so that the site visits don't have to happen as frequently as they might otherwise. And I believe that looking at the practices and also looking at what gets learned in terms of that situated knowing who provide some pointers about, well, what are the kinds of affordances that would really be useful here? And I don't think it's about meeting support. It's about supporting the work that people are doing together. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you. So we have, I think, about 15 minutes for questions.
I could actually continue Scott's idea about if the question if it's actually impossible to extract situational information. I was kind of thinking about whether it might be more like a cost-effective problem in terms of it just might be too damn difficult to do that. Because I'm kind of thinking this the analogy that I had was kind of thinking about different kind of fictive worlds, or even TV series, or take Lord of the Rings as a kind of world that we once you kind of get into it, if you spend a lot of time in fiction, which is basically a description of people, you kind of relate to those characters and kind of get to know them. You can kind of think about if you were like 10 years ago, we were sitting in the living room with the friends, what you could talk with the different characters, which might make a lot of sense to you. But I mean that, so this kind of brings into the question that maybe the situated information is extractable, but it's just normally just too difficult to do that. So it's probably just easier to ship the whole team to a different country rather than trying to create a large anthropological field study out of how those people there are.
Yeah, although I guess I would separate out the question of extractable from the question of can we provide more situated knowledge using technology. I mean, certainly, let's say at the extreme, it's not even at the extreme. Let's look at the new robots that Willow Garage is developing, the Texeye robot, that, where you can go and you can hang out in that environment and your robot can drive around and it can go to the coffee corner and it can chat with people and it can go to lunch and so forth. So would that help then with this situated knowing who? I actually think that it would in some ways. I think that you'd be able to get some of the insights along most of the dimensions that we talked about. So, and that's not extracting it, it's actually learning it, but through different means. Yeah, Wendy.
One has to do with whether it matters that the site visits are in one place or the other, or at a third place.
Yeah.
So, for example, we used to go off on what we called woods meetings because they were in the woods, not really, but some hotel somewhere that was kind of neutral ground, and so you get a lot of the hanging out and talking with people and chatting, but you don't see people in their work context.
Right.
And my guess is that that helps more with the personal relationships, which is sort of what it's designed for, and you get some work done, as opposed to going to the site visit where you're really emphasizing one culture or the other, and so on. So I'm just curious if you looked at that.
Yes, absolutely, and I do have strong opinions about that. I actually am not, in most cases, not a big fan of the neutral territory. Because the truth is, we don't work in neutral territory. And in just some of the lightweight quantitative research that we've done, we were doing a study prior to this one of a large company that was split, teams were split between the US and, again, Europe. And as it turned out, a large percentage of the people that we were studying had done these sort of intensive, week-long together kinds of things. And we were studying them about 6 months after that. There was zero correlation, just no relationship whatsoever between having done those intensive neutral sessions and their later ability to work together. And I think in part, it's the stuff that I'm talking about here. Learning to work together is learning how people work, not, what kind of beer do you like, right? And that's useful information, but that also gets learned during the site visits. So now to your second question, which I think is also really important, is the direction of the travel. The direction, I believe, has to be both ways. because, I mean, just the very model here, right? If all we're learning is about France, and the folks in France aren't learning anything about the US, you don't have the same kind of situated knowing that enables the contextual knowledge that's so important here. Not only that, what we saw was in India, basically the travel in this organization up till this point in time had been out of India and not into India. That meant that nobody else really understood the context that they were working in, and it was also really insulting. I mean, basically the message that they were receiving is, you're just not a very important, not a very valuable place, and you're unstable, and we're afraid of the food and so forth, so we're not going to come and visit you. And people were really hurt by that and felt devalued as a result of it. So, and what we saw was that when people did go to some of the lower status sites, it was hugely important for the ongoing relationship, because people felt like they were now part of the team.
I just want to say that doesn't just apply to India. Just a quick anecdote of a senior vice president from Xerox coming to the launch of the new site in France and saying to everybody, we think it's wonderful here. We're really happy to be creating this new site here. Look at this brilliant castle, and the mountains are right there. It's great to go skiing, and we're just happy to visit you. Yeah, the reaction was not entirely positive, as you might anticipate. So that issue of respect is really important.
Terry.
So this is coming from a sort of company point of view, which is not where I really start, but some manager who's in charge of this says, I believe all this, it's great, costs a huge amount to do this.
Right.
How can you quantify the benefits so I know I'm getting the right amount of return on that investment?
Right. So at this point, we don't have a quantitative study to quantify the benefits, and honestly, I don't think we could, because how do you quantify? Yeah, I mean, you could look at the quality of the product, you could look at the duration, but what do you compare that to, since not all software developments are necessarily equal and so forth. But and that's something I'm also concerned about, and I'm concerned about the carbon footprint as well. I mean, it doesn't seem like a good idea to be out there advocating for people to get on more airplanes and travel more. But I think what this allows us to do is to think more strategically about how we're using those resources. So the travel both directions is really important. What happens during the field site or during the site visit is really important. So you don't just travel over for a meeting and then fly back home, but actually spend time there. Just sort of guesstimates in our research is that you should have somebody traveling about every 6 months, one direction or the other for these long-term teens. It doesn't need to be sort of constant travel. And I don't think that it makes sense to send the whole team all at once, because what happens oftentimes in those cases is they end up getting separated, and you don't have the kind of integration that's useful. So what I actually believe is most effective is just sort of this trickle of people going periodically when it makes sense at a time during the project. So I actually think that you could save money on travel by not doing these big sort of everybody go to a castle and hang out for a week, and just use these site visits more sparingly. Yeah.
Have you looked at doing these kind of things within one similar culture, so teams are distributed but only nationally? And do you lose a lot of the effects and the benefits of these site visits when you're working in something that's more similar of a culture, let's say between like the two coasts of the U.S. or another such context?
That's a really good question. How much of the lack of knowledge about one another and their cultures sort of contributed to the... I think it's a combination. I think that we got, I don't have the data to look at the comparison, but I believe that what we're seeing is more extreme results for the site visits because of the cultural differences, because there were more concerns about, if somebody seems angry all the time and they're from a different culture, I'm less likely to know what to do about that and what that means than if they're from the same culture, right? So it just created more anxiety and more discomfort and more concern about offending people because you don't know what to do. Having said that, though, there was a lot of similarity between the U.S. and the European culture. People didn't feel like there was as much cultural distance there, and yet we saw the same kinds of things. We saw that sort of knowing who was still pretty important to the relationship. It was primarily Germany.
Right, because the Germans also have a very, I just had a very negative experience with working with one German colleague because of these same kind of things, and we've had a very positive experience with another German colleague. But there's a very particular mentality, right, and it's very different than working with, say, the British or with the French or with Spanish. So when we say Europe, I think it's important to characterize the country because within Europe we have so many different working styles.
Absolutely.
Coast to coast may not be so different, but certainly would if you have people in Texas.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Or New York. Let's see.
I'm just wondering if we could extend the conclusions about your work for distance learning process. I mean, the subjective aspect of it, how it affects the learning process itself.
So can you say a little bit more? Like if you're
You have
presenting.
technology for distance learning,
Yeah.
but you don't have the contact. You don't get the know-how or
Right.
know who or whatever.
Right.
People are apart with a big pipe, with image,
Yeah.
sound, smell, maybe. But you see, that subjective relationship is.
Yeah, and I guess the question that I'd want to sort of start with there is, to what extent is the knowing who, knowing the instructor, knowing the other class members, to what extent is that important to the learning process? And I think my guess is it would depend a lot on what was being taught. I'm guessing that probably teaching mathematics, it would be a little bit less important than, say, teaching negotiation skills. But.
One more question.
Uh-oh. Okay, yeah.
Going back to sort of the reports inside the quotes, I didn't see much evidence of roles within the team. And I could imagine perhaps a baseline might be, well, if you see in some groups, the implementers and the QA people at each other as cats and dogs, irrespective of well, then we've got an integrated group. Just thinking. So did you see any role issues, other than, say, management versus non-management?
Not a lot. I mean, for the most part, the members of the team were developers. We did have one team that had some QA folks on it. And the QA people pretty much talked to the other QA people, and developers talked to the developers on that team. I'd say the one thing, I lost my train of thought. There was something with regard to roles. Oh, the lead architect. The lead architect made so many decisions about what was actually going to go into the release that being co-located with or really knowing the lead architect was actually very, very important. And people who weren't located with or didn't feel like they knew the lead architect felt much less influential over the way their work got done, and they felt like they were always at risk that their work wasn't going to end up being valued. But that was the only role that really seemed to be sort of critical that people talked about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.